So I'm going to be talking about values and how those relate to the Great Transition. And I'm a psychologist, so I approach these things from a scientific perspective and from thinking about what people care about and what's going on in people's minds, as well as what's going on in the broader culture, which influences what's going on in people's minds and vice versa. And I think the reason that values are really important in this kind of conversation across various CSOs is I do think values are one of the things that can unite us. And as Maya was saying, we need to find these things where we're in agreement to work towards something more basic. And I hope to show you today that one of the things that I think would be useful in that way that could unite us has to do with values. So let's start by defining what I mean by values and by the closely related concept of goals. These are guiding principles in life. So these are ideas that we hold within our own minds or within our own society which help guide us, which help us figure out what to do next as we're approaching all the decisions that we have to make as we live our lives or as we make policies, etc. And they're things that tell us what's important in the world, and when we see that something is important, it ends up affecting our attitudes towards particular objects and particular policies. So if something that I very much value is money, let's say, then I'm going to have a particularly positive attitude towards magazines like Forbes and Inc., and I'm going to have particularly positive attitudes towards policies which are designed to maximize economic growth and corporate profit. If I don't care so much about those kinds of things, then I'm not going to have those kinds of attitudes. And the research is very clear about how our values influence our attitudes. We also know that values influence behavior. Now, it's not a perfect correlation because there's all kinds of other things that can intervene that keep us from engaging in behaviors which are consistent with our values. But nonetheless, one of the things we know is that if we have certain values, that influences what we actually go and do next. Okay? So again, if I really care a lot about money, I'm probably likely to work longer hours or want to go shopping and buy a Rolls Royce and those kinds of things, which are particular behaviors. If I don't care about money, I'm less likely to do those sorts of things. Now, it might seem that there are an infinite number of values and goals that are out there, but that's not actually the case. The research suggests that among the variety of different goals that are out there, there's actually about 10 or 12 different values which do emerge consistently across culture. And this is based on research which has been done in literally dozens of nations around the world with tens of thousands of different people, okay? So we're fairly confident that this is how values seem to work in people's minds. And that these values are organized in systems, okay? So to talk about one value in and of itself doesn't actually make any sense, okay? Whenever we think about values, what we have to think about are value systems. And I like to use the analogy of a value pie, okay? So imagine that you have a pie that has a variety of different slices to it, okay? And you might have a slice that has to do with partying and hedonistic pleasures. You might have a slice that has to do with your family. You might have a slice that has to do with money, etc. Okay? And what we can do is we can measure how big each of those slices is to you. So maybe you have just a little sliver for religion, but for you, religion is a really big thing. Now, the really important aspect about this for systems is, of course, as one slice gets bigger, another slice is going to have to get smaller. All right? When Friday at 4 o'clock comes, I can't both stay and work harder and get another grant proposal and go home and play with my kids. Okay? I have to make a choice. And part of what influences that choice has to do with my values. Now, as I mentioned, these systems that I'm about to show you have been validated in many, many different nations around the world. And the very important thing that I want you to walk away from our conversation today with is that these value systems are organized in very consistent ways across cultures in people's minds, such that some values are compatible with each other. And what that means is that if I value one thing, it's relatively easy for me to also care about something else. But other values stand in conflict with each other. Okay? That if I value one value, it's relatively difficult to simultaneously care about that same value. Now we can represent these value conflicts and compatibilities with something that are called circumplex models. And so what these are going to be, it's going to be a circle that I'm about to show you, and values which are next to each other in these circles are ones which are psychologically consistent with each other, relatively easy to care about simultaneously. Values on the opposite side of the circle are values which are in conflict with each other, where it's relatively difficult to simultaneously care about them. And I want to emphasize before I show you these values two things, these circumplexes, two things. The first is that these are not theoretical models. These are models based on data collected from thousands and thousands of people who've told us how much they care about different values. Okay? So this isn't just something psychologists made up in their head. This is based on data. The second thing I want to emphasize is that these values, and you'll see this later, are going to act in opposition to each other when they're in conflict, and there's going to be bleed over from one value to another when they're compatible. And I hope to show you the data for that as we go along here. Now here's the first value model, and this comes from the work of somebody named Shalom Schwartz, who's probably the most prominent value researcher in the world. And can everybody see okay? Now there's a lot of information up here. I don't want you to try to pay attention to it all. The first thing that I want to orient you to here are these self-enhancement values for achievement and power. Now these are values that concern trying to enhance yourself, trying to be better than you are or to seem better than you are. And they concern specific values for things like social power, wealth, authority, being successful, being influential. These are the values which load in that part of the circumplex. Now, another set of values that are in this circumplex have to do with the self-transcendence values. And these are for universalism and benevolence. So here what I really want you to understand is that to the extent people care about achievement, they also tend to care about power. Those are why those things are next to each other. Okay? And to the extent people care about universalism, they tend to care about benevolence too. But these values for universalism and benevolence tend to stand in opposition to the achievement power values. Okay? Now those self-transcendent values are ones that most CSOs are working towards, caring about being helpful, responsible, social justice, equality, ecological values like a world of beauty and protecting the environment. Now, here's another circumplex model that my colleagues and I have developed. A smaller number of nations than Schwartz has looked at, but still about 15 different nations. And we end up with some very similar kinds of findings. So over here, we have what we call the extrinsic values for popularity, image, and financial success. So here are some of the items that we assess. So things about wanting money, things about having the right look, things about being admired. Hopefully you recognize those are kind of like those self-enhancing values, okay? A lot of the same kinds of concerns are going on with extrinsic and self-enhancing values. These stand in opposition to the intrinsic values, okay? And these concern things that are similar to the self-transcendent values. So expressing your love for special people, helping the world be a better place, assisting others. And again, what we find is that if you care about image, you tend to care about popularity and financial success, which makes sense. To have the right image, you're usually trying to be popular through your image, right? And usually you need money to have that image, the car, the house, or whatever. And then these values stand in opposition to the community, affiliation, and self-acceptance values. Okay, so why is this relevant to you? Well, what we know from other data is that the extent to which people care about these different values is associated with outcomes that I think CSOs are very interested in changing, or in influencing at least. Well-being, so how happy or satisfied people are in lives. Their pro-social attitudes and behaviors, how much they actually try to help others. And then their ecological attitudes and behaviors, how much they try to work towards sustainability. So I'm going to give you an extremely brief overview of some of that data. There's far more data out there about these issues than I have time to present, but I just want to give you a general sense. So let's talk about well-being first. One of the things we know is that the extent to which one focuses on those extrinsic values for money and power and status is associated with lower well-being, with less happiness. So the more that people buy into the consumer capitalist message that what's really important is to make a lot of money and have a lot of possessions, the less happy they are. So for example, we know that people who are focused on these extrinsic values have less self-actualization, that Maslowian idea of being all you can be. They are less vital, they're less energized and alive. They report lower levels of life satisfaction. And in diary measures, they experience less pleasant emotions like happiness and contentment and joy. On the other hand, the more people are focused on those materialistic extrinsic values, the more anxious and depressed they are, the more physical symptoms like headaches, stomach aches, backaches they have, the more unpleasant emotions they have, and the more they use drugs and alcohol. Now, it probably is a way to sort of self-medicate themselves. Now, in contrast, those intrinsic values are associated with more happiness and less distress. Okay, so these values really have important implications for people's well-being. Furthermore, these kinds of effects have been shown in many, many different samples around the world. Here's an incomplete list of some of the nations in which there's been an association between values and well-being of the sort that I just mentioned. And it's also been found in quite a variety of different types of people, children as young as 10 years old, adults into their 80s, college students, adults, business people as well. Very interestingly, business people who care a lot about making money are less happy than business people who aren't so focused on making money. Now, we also know that these values are associated with social outcomes. Okay, so many people in this room, I'm sure, are interested in issues of social justice and feeding the poor and eliminating racism and things like that. Now, we know that these values are associated with these sorts of outcomes. So, for example, the more people are focused on those extrinsic self-enhancing values, the less empathic they are. Now, that's one of the things I bet everybody in here banks on in order to get their work done, is that other people care about someone else's plight. But if you're focused on those extrinsic values, the research shows you tend to be less empathic. The more you're focused on the intrinsic values, the more empathic you are. We also know that those extrinsic self-enhancing values are associated with what's called a social dominance orientation, which basically means my group is better than yours, and that's because your group is lazy or stupid or whatever. And so you deserve all the bad things that have happened to you. And I deserve all the good things that have happened to me because my group's better. The more people are focused on those extrinsic materialistic values, the more they endorse those kinds of attitudes. They also tend to endorse more attitudes which are supportive of racial and ethnic prejudice, which again, I'm sure many of you in here are trying to work against. With regard to behavior, we know that more people are focused on extrinsic and enhancing values. The less likely they are to engage in pro-social helping behaviors, the more likely they are to engage in antisocial behaviors like cheating and stealing and such like that. And we also know that these values bear different relationships with cooperative versus competitive behavior. So if you're focused on intrinsic self-transcendent values, that tends to promote more cooperation, which I imagine, again, most of you are interested in facilitating. On the other hand, extrinsic values tend to be associated with more competitive behavior. Now finally, we have the ecological correlates. There are a lot of ecological problems out there these days. It's not just about climate change. It's also about species extinction and pollution and loss of habitat, which again, I'm sure many of you in here are working on. We know these values bear relationships with ecological attitudes. So one of the fundamental things we know is that the more people are focused on those self-enhancing values for money and power and status, the less they tend to care about protecting the environment and having a world of beauty. We know that the more people are focused on those self-enhancing values, when you ask them, why are you bothered about environmental damage? They aren't very bothered about it by how much it affects other people in other nations. They don't really care about how it affects other animals. They don't really care how it affects future generations. They care about how it might affect them. Okay? On the other hand, to the extent people are focused on the intrinsic transcendent values, then they do care about how it affects other people, animals, and future generations. We also know that these values are related to people's actual behaviors ecologically. So for example, the more people are intrinsic and transcendent, the more likely they ride bikes, recycle, reuse stuff. And also it is associated with their ecological footprint. So higher intrinsic values are associated with lower ecological footprints. Higher extrinsic values are associated with higher ecological footprints, thus using up more resources. Finally, I have a paper that just came out that looked at values at the level of the nation. And what we did was we were able to look at 20 wealthy nations, Europe, North America, Australia, Japan, and we got a measure of how much the citizens in those nations cared about the enhancing values of achievement, power, status, money, versus how much they cared about the transcendent values of loyalty, helpfulness, social justice, etc. And we correlated that with CO2 emissions. Even after controlling for how wealthy a nation is, the more a nation is oriented towards achievement, power, status, the more carbon it emits per capita, okay? And the more it's associated with these helpfulness, social justice values, the less carbon it emits per capita. So I'd like to suggest that there are 3 implications for CSOs to be thinking about with regard to these data. That could be influencing how you do your campaigns, could be influencing how you're thinking about communicating with people, could be influencing the kinds of systems thinking we'll be talking about eventually. Now the first is that I hope it makes sense that one of the things you want to do is to avoid encouraging or activating these self-enhancing extrinsic values. Because to the extent that CSOs say, oh, the reason that you should do this is because it's, buy a CFL because it's going to save you money. Essentially, what you've just done is to encourage and activate the extrinsic values. So everybody see that? Okay. What you've just said is the reason to do this is because of money. All right. The reason that I loved the green greed there, I'd never heard that idea before, but it's a wonderful terminology, okay? But that's a lot of what a lot of environmental organizations have capitulated to, because they believe the only way they're going to make any progress is to buy into the whole business model. Well, then what you're doing is you're reinforcing that business model when it all boils down, and then you're reinforcing the very values that all the research I just presented shows is associated with lower well-being, lower pro-social behavior, and worse ecological attitudes. So I think we have to avoid capitulating into this dominant model. The other, what I hope is obvious answer is that we need to encourage and activate these self-transcendent and intrinsic values. Now, I'm just an academic. I've been in school since I'm 5 years old. And one of the things, though, that I've learned about what's happened in the environmental and other CSO movements is that it seems like there was this place where the CSOs were really moralistic and stuff like that. And they found that didn't work, which isn't surprising, because making people feel guilty doesn't really motivate them much. And it seems like then they gave up on talking about these intrinsic values a lot, or they backed away from them. But I think it's really important to move into figuring out how better to talk about how to encourage and activate these self-transcendent intrinsic values in the work that we're doing, because those are the values which the research shows are associated with being happier and more socially just and more sustainable. The final implication I want to talk about has to do with developing campaigns to eliminate the root causes of self-enhancing and extrinsic values, and we'll come back to that at the end. I want to first give you a little bit of data here about the importance of these first 2 implications, okay? So here's a study that Greg Mayo did at the University of Cardiff, all right? So he brings people into the laboratory, all right? And he says, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you a bunch of note cards that have words on them. And I want you to sort them into categories. And there's going to be 3 categories. Now, some of those note cards have adjectives on there, red or nice or cloudy or whatever, okay? Some of the note cards have items of furniture on them, table and desk and chair. Now, here's the manipulation. For one group of people, the third set of note cards has words on it that have to do with the benevolence values, those self-transcendent values. Helpful, forgiving, honest, okay? So that group of people has got adjectives, furniture, or benevolence words. A second group of people has adjectives, furniture words, or achievement-related words like ambitious, capable, successful. A third group of people has adjectives, furniture, or food. Okay, that's the control group. So everybody comes in and all they're doing is sorting words. You got to keep that in mind. That's all they're doing. They've just got these note cards, they're sorting words. Then what Mao does is he asks them to volunteer to do something. Now you guys ask people to volunteer all the time, right? Okay. He asks people to volunteer to do something, and he measures how much time they're willing to volunteer. And here's what he finds. Here's the control group, okay? They're the ones that did furniture, adjective, and food, right? Just by sorting words that had to do with benevolence value, people volunteered to do more time, okay? Just by sorting words that had to do with achievement, power, status, less. This is a significant difference. All he did was to activate the circumplex in people's minds, okay? All he did here was he turned on this part of people's value system in the sorting system, okay, in that sorting task. He just turned it on. And by turning it on, it suppressed this system, which is the one that's going to make you volunteer, okay? Just by getting people to think about this system, it increased volunteering. I hope you can see the relevance to this as to how you think about doing campaign communications. We can find the same thing with regard to ecological behavior. Martin van Steenkist in Belgium did a study where he brought people into the lab. These were education students. And he asked them to read a text about recycling. And there were two conditions here. They either read this text about recycling where it talked about recycling and how it would benefit the community if you recycled. Or they read a text about recycling that said this would save you money if you recycle. Okay, so they either gave it a frame that was intrinsic or a frame that was extrinsic. A week later, these people come back into the lab and they take a test that looks at how much they learned. Compared to the people who were given the extrinsic frames, the ones who were given the intrinsic frames learned the material more deeply. They did better on the recycling test. Here's what else Martin did. He also told them that there was information on recycling available at the library, and he was able from the librarian to know who went and got that more information. The people who were in the intrinsic condition went and got more information from the library. In that intervening week, he also gave them a chance to go to a recycling plant on a field trip. He saw who signed up. The people who got it framed in an intrinsic fashion were more likely to sign up to go on the field trip. Very simple manipulations. But what's happening again is that you're activating different parts of the circumplex and encouraging different parts of the circumplex. This one isn't going to lead to sustained caring about recycling because these values are opposed to those ecological concerns. These, on the other hand, will support it. So let's talk about the third implication, which is to develop campaigns to eliminate the root causes of these self-enhancing extrinsic values. So there's all kinds of things out there in the world which make people care about self-enhancing and extrinsic values, not just CSOs with unfortunate communication strategies. Okay? There's all kinds of different things out there which influence them. My colleagues and I have devised a system where we talk about two main kinds. The first has to do with social modeling. So we know from the research that the more people are exposed to social models that suggest that materialistic, extrinsic, self-enhancing values are important, the more they think that too. Okay? So if your friends and your parents and your peers care about those things, then that's what you care about. Okay? If you watch television a lot, then you're going to be more materialistic, extrinsic, etc. The flip side, the more your parents and peers care about intrinsic values, the more you're going to care about those, the less TV you watch, the less of those materialistic messages you're going to be getting. There's one place where we can see CSOs, right? You could be a social model differently. We also know that insecurity tends to lead people over towards those extrinsic self-enhancing values. So if your parents got divorced or were particularly cold in their parenting, the research shows that you become more extrinsic. Okay, why? Well, because feeling insecure it comes from divorce, okay, and comes from cold parenting. People try to cope with that by orienting towards these extrinsic values. If you're in poverty, that tends to make people more focused on these extrinsic values. We've done experimental studies where we randomly assign people to think about their own death or to think about listening to music. Thinking about your own death increases your extrinsic self-enhancing values and decreases your intrinsic values. Okay? And death, of course, is the insecurity par excellence. So again, what we can be thinking about here are campaign strategies to decrease the social modeling in the environment of the extrinsic self-enhancing values, increase the modeling of intrinsic values, and promote widespread security. Those things, and this is really great, I think, for a CSO because you're interested in those things anyway, and these can have these ripple effects on people's values. Now, of course, the other big thing we have to be thinking about, and that the paper that you're asked to read on Great Transition points to, has to do with neoliberal capitalism. Okay? So we live under an economic organization which is very interested in promoting the self-enhancing extrinsic values, because those are the values which are necessary in order to sustain that system. Now, we don't have time to talk about all the systems thinking right now, but one of the things that any system needs in order to keep working is people who believe in that system, okay? And people who have the same values as that system, all right? And corporate capitalism does a great job of trying to get people to believe that what's most important is to focus on profit. What's most important is to buy a lot of stuff because that's what's going to make you happy. What's most important is to have a nation with continual high levels of economic growth. All right? That's what the system needs in order to maintain itself. Now, what we also know is that if you live in a nation which is very focused on neoliberal capitalism, the more you are likely to have citizens who care about the extrinsic self-enhancing values. And this has been shown empirically in 2 different studies now, okay? This again is not just some theoretical statement. Empirically, we are able to measure how much a nation organizes its economy in a competitive fashion, which is the neoliberal turn everything over to the free market way, or in a cooperative fashion, okay, which is more sort of trying to bring people together and get government involvement, etc. The more a nation is focused in a competitive way, the more people care about money, power, status, and achievement. The more that a nation is organized in what the Wall Street Journal Index calls economic freedom, i.e. deregulation, okay, the more the citizens care about money, power, status, achievement. Now, when you look at the circumplex, then what you should also expect is that the more that a nation lives in a competitive way, the less the people care about the self-transcendent values, and that's indeed exactly what you find. Okay? So because that's what has to happen the way values are organized in people's minds. So, what are some ways forward that we could be thinking of as we think about CSOs and their actions? Well, one of the things I think we can be talking about is to promote new lifestyles. So these voluntary simplicity and downshifting are more or less synonymous with each other. The choice to back out of the work, spend, work some more because I went too much into debt lifestyle, okay? Now again, for an organization that maybe is focused particularly on the environment or only on trying to help eradicate poverty, you wouldn't think, why would I want to promote voluntary simplicity, right? But what we know is that that lifestyle is associated with more intrinsic values, more self-transcendent values, okay? And so if we can join together and think about we're trying to work to change values and shift values, then it makes sense to join forces and say, yeah, how can my single issue organization work to promote voluntary simplicity and downshifting? Okay, and time affluence as well, okay? Working multiple hours a week is associated with less happiness, less time to do pro-social behavior, worse ecological outcomes. We could have efforts in that direction too. Another thing we can look at has to do with campaigns regarding advertising. Advertising is one of the major ways in which materialistic self-enhancing values are promoted. Some nations ban advertising to children, most do not, but that's a direction to head. Whenever I come to the subway, the tube here in London, I always walk through and I look at all the ads and I think, what must it have been like 70 years ago to ride the tube? Because I doubt it was full of advertisements like it is now, okay? There's been a shift, okay? And what's happening, I'm riding down the escalator, and what's happening is every single moment I'm getting those extrinsic values activated, right? Okay? And so are our kids. I don't know what the rules are in your nation, but in my nation, every dollar that a business spends on advertising is tax deductible. Now, why? Because it's good for the economy. Think it through. Okay? It's good for the economy the more they're advertising, because then people are out there buying and profit goes up. Okay? This is something some of us have been talking about for years to try to remove the tax deduction for advertising. And interestingly, just about a month ago, Betsy knows this too, I think, just about a month ago in Advertising Age, there was an article written by some people saying, who are advertisers, saying, hey, we're kind of starting to get worried that they're going to get rid of this tax deduction. We better start getting our act together to lobby against that. Well, I would say we need to start getting our act together to lobby for it. Think if you just taxed at 10% all the billions and billions of dollars spent on advertising. Okay? A, you're taxing a form of pollution. Value pollution. And B, you could use that money in order to support all kinds of positive efforts in order to promote intrinsic and self-transcendent values. I'm almost done. The third thing, which we've already heard about and that I fully support, is adopting alternative indicators. Right now, all of the alternative indicators privilege extrinsic self-enhancing values. Did money change hands? That's all they care about. Did money change hands? Did somebody make a profit? Okay? As long as we think that's what's important, then that's what we're going to keep developing policies for. If we develop alternative indicators that include intrinsic values, which the genuine progress indicators do, and the well-being indicators do, and the Happy Planet Index does, then we could be promoting these other values. And finally, I think we need to attack corporate power head-on. Okay? We need to take a look at the fact that our governments, certainly my government in the United States, especially after last year's Supreme Court decision which said corporations can donate as much as they want to politics, we need to take that on right away in terms of campaign finance and in terms of the WTO. That's all I have to say. I thank you for your attention.